As I've mentioned in another video, David Foster Wallace's fiction was heavily inspired by television, but not just TV shows. The entire culture influenced by TV became a driving force behind a lot of his work. One of his main points in an essay called E Unibus Plurum is that TV relies on irony, and this has come to dominate postmodern American culture. There is a ton of content about Wallace's take on irony, and I don't have a lot to say about it, but I will say, while David Foster Wallace's criticism of postmodernism seems like a social and cultural critique within the postmodern era, I think it's too often overlooked that his fiction provides an interesting access into postmodern philosophy, which is notoriously difficult to understand, and often when people do start to understand it, it seems so obvious that it's negligible. David Foster Wallace's fiction shows that postmodern philosophy is deeply intertwined with contemporary human experience, and his hope to be post-postmodern might provide a way forward for some of the limitations of postmodern philosophy. I highly encourage you to check out other videos about actual postmodern philosophers, because I'm just going to provide a broad picture. Several of David Foster Wallace's stories, such as The Suffering Channel and Little Expressionless Animals, showcase his exploration of TV and individuals living in postmodern TV culture. Infinite Jest has a ton of content about TV and film as well, but none of his stories capture the essence of his stance on postmodernism better than a story called My Appearance. I get that it's presumptuous to talk about what he intended when writing the story, but since he lays out a lot of his ideas on fiction and postmodernism and TV culture in that essay called E Unibus Plurum, and since I think these ideas are clearly present in My Appearance, for the sake of this video, I'm going to say that he intended all of this just because that makes it easier to talk about. If that really turns you off, then I'll let my birds poop on you. My Appearance is the story of a woman named Edelin who makes an appearance on Late Show with David Letterman. It's significant that David Foster Wallace chose a talk show, a program with the intention of creating the illusion of a relaxed, genuine conversation. But most of the time, the conversations on a talk show are pre-established. They aren't exactly scripted, but it is understood that most guests come on prepared to say a few funny and charming things and plug their movie or album or special. It's a production that requires a performed lack of self-consciousness, a phrase that David Foster Wallace uses in the essay E Unibus Plurum, and also a phrase that I have repeated a ton after living in LA for a couple years, surrounded by actors. So I want to emphasize this for a moment. A performed lack of self-consciousness isn't exactly the same thing as being fake. Rather, it's a more specific kind of being fake. Generally, being fake is about having a certain hollowness undergirding how you're intending to come across. A performed lack of self-consciousness is still hollow, but the intention is to appear unmotivated by how you appear. A contrived ignorance of how you will be perceived. Think Jennifer Lawrence. So the main character, Edelin, goes into this setting that demands a performed lack of self-consciousness after her husband and her manager coach her on how to appear. They even give her an earpiece so that they can feed her what to say. And during the interview, she takes the earpiece out and decides to be herself instead, to great effect. This is an excellent character action that shows her becoming more assertive instead of listening to her manager and husband. And David Letterman, after the interview, says to her in a way that I take to be sincere, that she was a very engaging guest and that he'd love to have her back. So that's the narrative action, but under the hood of the story, we have a profound statement about being genuine in spite of human constructs. Usually when someone calls something a construct, it's a way to dismantle or deconstruct it. This is a common, even colloquial by now, postmodern critical unmasking, a phrase I got from Levi Bryant. For example, people might think that women are supposed to behave a certain way because they are women, but a postmodern critical unmasking of this thought is to dismantle the idea of female behavior, revealing it to be a socially constructed category that isn't consistent across or inherent to female individuals. So if you see how this idea of female behavior is a construct, it shouldn't be hard at all to see how a TV show is a construct. That is, most people when watching TV aren't under the impression that the action on screen is a candid moment. It's composed and produced and presented in order to be viewed. Even when candid moments or live events are broadcast, there is still a conceptual difference between what is shown on screen and the actual event being recorded. This tension between the constructed image of something and the actual thing is Postmodernism 101. Similar ideas include the idea that the word tree is not a tree. A picture of a tree isn't a tree, and the idea that comes to mind when you think of a tree is not a tree. Even when you're looking at an actual tree, technically what you see is your mind's representation of a tree. But using a tree as an example is just a way to illustrate the tension between a thing and a representation of that thing. This has profound implications for society, politics, and individuals' understanding of themselves and the world. The tension between things and the representation of those things led postmodern philosopher Baudrillard to declare that the Gulf War did not take place. This is obviously a provocative claim and sounds like a conspiracy theory, but the point isn't that he didn't believe in the Gulf War. People who weren't actually in the Gulf War only saw representations of it on TV, in newspapers, etc. In a postmodern society, we are so saturated in images, representations, symbols, and simulations that we have lost sight of a sense of reality. And he also used the term simulacra, which is a copy that has no original, a copy of a copy. In postmodern society, the things that representations are supposed to represent seem lost or fundamentally removed from us, and even the present moment can be shown to be contingent on our perception. If that sounds like a bummer to you, you can see how the idea that everything is a construct or a representation could lead to cynicism and despair. I think the sadness comes from a projection of authenticity that is somehow denied to us, kind of like a pessimistic view of Plato's theory of forms, that the perfect version of something is transcendent, and the world we have is composed of lesser, imperfect versions of those perfect forms. This idea translated into postmodern terms would be more that a concept or a word for something doesn't perfectly match up with what it refers to. To go back to the tree example, a lot of people don't really care if the word tree matches up with actual trees. But for concepts like love, justice, morality, and other abstractions, this can be immensely distressing. To make matters worse, these concepts often describe internal subjective experience, so we can't be certain that we're even talking about the same thing when we use these words. According to postmodern philosophy, language is basically insufficient at doing what it intends to. Even if you're a more visual thinker or you are unreflectively immersed in the present moment, our perception of the world is still textual. That is, there's a process of reading it with our senses, and it operates in the same way a language does, through signs and symbols that appear to be demarcated from one another as unified objects. But tangible objects or philosophical objects of discussion or investigation are not actually unified. Things that we call objects are really just isolated frames of reference as the physical world hurtles through space. Picture an apple as just a moment in the transformation of a seed into decaying organic matter in your poop. And conceptual objects like an object of discussion or a seemingly unified idea like the idea of a tree are also contingent on other things outside of them and don't have a lot of unity unto themselves after all. So if nothing can be fully known because the very tools that we use to know things are insufficient, then what's the point of anything, man? Do you see why people might want to move past this way of thinking? This is far from coincidental to David Foster Wallace's themes, but rather than simply show the world to be composed of constructs like his postmodern predecessors like Pynchon, Wallace tried to push it further into something that might be called post-postmodernism, a set of ideas with a terrible name. So if postmodernism is about revealing that the apparent truth about the world is a construct, then post-postmodernism is about accepting that the world is constructed, but then trying to build something more assertive with these constructs, such as speculative realism or an object-oriented ontology. These have important differences, but I'm trying to keep it broad here, and if you're interested in learning more about them, check out the link to Levi Bryant's lecture in the description. To bring it back to more colloquial use, sometimes saying something is a construct is a way to dismiss it, but we can flip the script. Instead of thinking that the world is just a construct, we can frame our thinking that constructs are our access to the world. This is something that I think David Foster Wallace expertly portrayed in his fiction. So back to my appearance. Within the construct of a late-night show, which would seem to create falsity and jaded irony and all of the other things that David Foster Wallace railed against, the main character manages to transcend these limitations by being genuine. To put it even more simply, even though she's immersed in a construct, she manages to transcend the apparent falsity of construction. This is an idea that he explores in greater depth in his novel The Broom of the System, which shows an old lady who feels out of sorts because she's an elderly person who has no use anymore. That is, There's no constructed context from which to derive meaning in her life. The protagonist in this book also deals with these issues, being objectified by a man who puts her on a pedestal, thus refusing to give her a constructed social context with which she can actually engage, only to be set free by a man who is willing to bring her down to earth through a constructed context with which she can engage. This book is way more complicated than that, but I'm putting too fine of a point on it here in order to demonstrate Wallace's intersection of postmodern philosophy and human experience in his fiction. Have a good day.